We know perfectly well that that was template language. Frank, thank you very much for confirming that and explaining it. And everybody knows that, but everybody also understands that it was exactly what the Venezuelan government wanted to hear, and it was a trap that the United States fell into. A trap that the United States had been avoiding quite adroitly during many, many years, and it fell. So a lot of what has happened since was very predictable, absolutely predictable. We were going to get the same rhetoric and the reaction of Latin America. The other element that was perhaps wrong about it was the timing. President Obama needed to do something. He needed to respond to a bill that was produced by Congress. But he didn't need to do it at the beginning of March. He could have at least waited until after the summit. And I think if he had thought a little harder about the issue of timing, the announcement could have been postponed a little bit longer, and it would have avoided the crisis that we're now seeing that is going to take place at the summit. Maybe it won't be a big crisis, but it's going to be, prior to the decree by Obama, the United States was going to go to this summit with a wonderful, wonderful image, and the Venezuelan president was going to go with the worst image of any Venezuelan president since elections take place in Venezuela. And now, the image of Maduro has risen a little bit, and the image of the United States has gone down. So that's not great, and that's what we're trying to fix. That's the new crisis. So these are two criticizable elements: the language and the timing of the announcement. And I accept those. Having said that, it is very important that we understand a little bit of why the United States has done what it did with Venezuela. One could even argue that there was a significant provocation on the part of Venezuela to do something like this. And let me explain what I mean by this. During the month of February, Obama's decree is at the beginning of March. During the month of February, Maduro ordered a reduction of US personnel in Venezuela by almost 80%. Condemned the United States once again of being behind coup d'etat and assassinations. In other words, Venezuela has been arguing that it is the United States that's the national security threat of Venezuela consistently, and it does it again in February. And it bans entry into the country of 7 leaders. One of them is George Bush, and there's Dick Cheney, and the whole Cuban American delegation, Marco Rubio, Bob Menendez, Mario Diaz-Balart, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, telling them they're never going to come back to Venezuela. I am sure that sanction on American figures is not going to hurt as much as the American sanction on the 7 political figures that the Americans are sanctioning. But nevertheless, this was what was happening before. And think about it. You're the U.S. president. You're having pressures from Congress. You're having pressure from domestic politics, and you see this happening in Venezuela. But then, that's not the only thing that happened prior to the announcement of the decree. There was, and this is actually the most important crisis, and perhaps my most important point, and that is a major demonstration of diplomatic failure by UNASUR when it came to Venezuela. And let me be bigger than this. A delegation went to Venezuela at the beginning of March with the idea of trying to do something about the latest political arrest, a major arrest, as perhaps bigger than the arrest of Leopoldo Lopez, because it was the arrest of Antonio Ledesma, an elected official of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, is arrested. This is huge. And a UNASUR delegation went there and did nothing. Nothing at all. So we get a sign of US unilateralism, no doubt about it. But it is occurring in the context of a country that's in crisis, which is predictable, and this crisis is leading the government to be an agent provocateur, and it has done it, but also a crisis in Latin American diplomacy. The crisis is significant, and we need to think about it. The crisis is the region, despite what it professes, cannot defend the commitment to democratic governance in the Americas. As you know, in the OAS in 2001, one of its proudest moments, the members of the organization approved the Democratic Charter. And what we are now seeing, perhaps in Venezuela more so than in other cases, the real first test, the first time that we start to see actual systematic prosecution on the part of the state of political figures. You know, in Venezuela there have been house arrests. It's not just that they're arresting people in the streets, which you would expect when there are protests. The Venezuelan government is going into people's homes and kidnapping and arresting. This is, you know, if this isn't authoritarianism, I don't know what counts. And this should be the real test of the Democratic Charter. And the UNASUR delegation, of course, the UNASUR is not the OAS, I agree, it's a very different phenomenon. But in general, the context is that we're seeing an inter-American crisis when it comes to the issue of upholding democratic governance. And what do we get? We get exactly what people who have studied US-Latin American relations since the 1960s. And that is, whenever in the region the United States is involved in a particular crisis, as there is in Venezuela, the United States will act unilaterally in the absence of Latin American multilateralism. And this is what we're getting. In many ways, it's a little bit of deja vu all over again. I agree fully with Carlos Romero that the United States has not decoupled the Cuba-Venezuela alliance. It is remarkable that, in my opinion, Cuba is responding to the crisis with Venezuela a little bit much more mature than Maduro, pun intended, I guess. But the idea is, nevertheless, I still think that, as Carlos Romero explained in many, many ways, it is strategic alliance. Each country provides the other a subsidy that is not that costly to each other. So it's a relationship that is very stable based on that. And it's not going to disappear and perhaps might continue to become stronger. But really, my overall point, and that's the last statement I want to make, is that yes, we're seeing a huge crisis in U.S. Cuba and U.S.-Venezuela relations, but we're actually seeing a larger crisis, which is the failure of the region to do something effective in the face of very serious issues of democratic governance. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this distinguished panel. So my remarks today will be focused on the legal dimension of the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela. And since I'm not a political analyst, but rather just an informed newspaper reader who also happens to be Venezuelan, I will not offer any political assessment. And the reason why I make this disclaimer is because in Venezuela, as in any other part of Latin America, it is very common for almost anyone who belongs to that country to offer political commentary, and not only political commentary, but expert commentary. And if you want to test this, get on a taxi anywhere in the region, and after you greet the driver, simply ask them this question: how are things these days? And it is likely that you'll spend the rest of your ride listening to a deep analysis seasoned by the occasional reference to a credible source. I have a friend who's a general, my nephew is married to the daughter of X or Y or Z, and that's fairly common, and is part of the culture, and it's very important. You know, it sounds comical, but it's very serious in the sense that a lot of the news and a lot of the facts and the real analysis gets discounted by the way how the general population approaches serious problems. So when you have everybody in the room as an expert or with an expert opinion, then the experts are not really paid attention to. So turning to the topic that gathers us here today, by legal dimension, when I started by saying I'll focus on the legal dimension, I mean two things. Number one, the adaptation of the legal system to strengthen the relationship between the two states, Cuba and Venezuela, and moreover, the documentation of a political relationship. So how much law has been created in order to strengthen the ties? We're always paying attention, or those of you who are not lawyers, pay attention to the political discourse, to the handshakes and the hugs and the "you're my son and I'm your father" type of relationship between the Castros and Chavez, then Chavez and now Maduro. But there is a strong legal platform that nobody really pays attention to, that I would like to highlight today. And then the second facet of this legal dimension is the use of legal tools or legal instruments as facilitators of many of these political programs, and I'll close with that. And the reference there will be to the social programs called the Bolivarian Misiones, about which Javier has written extensively. But before I delve into each of these two facets, I would like to offer a brief commentary about the role of law and legal institutions in countries such as Venezuela and Cuba that are perceived as arbitrary systems. So the general perception outside of Cuba and Venezuela is that these are two arbitrary systems where the rule of law is not respected, where legal institutions are not important, where lawyers are not important, the legal profession is, down the drain. The contrary is true, with a caveat that I'm going to refer to in a bit. And if you remember the first meaningful plan that Chavez voiced, even during one of the things that got him elected in the first place, you had a political outsider who had no network, no strong political network, who offered to amend the Constitution. So his bold move, and his first actual move, he did deliver that promise. The promise that he made and delivered right away was to promote a constitutional amendment. He said a comprehensive constitutional amendment. So this, at least from the symbolic standpoint, and later on it proved that it was more symbolic than real, from a symbolic standpoint, meant a lot. Meant a lot to a country that was not really hopeful about the rule of law, but in a way, that idea of, I will reform the Constitution because we have to act within the constitutional framework. People say that Chavez at the time was not thinking about kicking the table, but even if he was thinking about kicking the table, because political leaders who have kicked the table, by kick the table I mean to just subvert the rules, have abide by rules. So if you look at Castro in the early days, most of the measures that then have been deemed arbitrary measures were legal measures. There was a law passed to do this, there was a law passed to expropriate and confiscate. There was a legal costume given to some measures that were not necessarily legitimate in the eyes of the population, but they had to be given this idea of legality. So the symbolism of law has been very, very important, and has become even more important to leaders such as Chavez and Castro and Maduro. Maduro is less legalistic than Chavez, or it appears to be less legalistic than Chavez, and although he has been in power for much less than Chavez was. If you look at the first years of Chavez, or any given year of Chavez, the amount of legislation that the government produced was much more copious than what Maduro has done. That's a way to compare it. So the constitutional amendment in Venezuela was one of the landmark aspects here. Then the passage of myriads of laws regulating every imaginable aspect of the country's life. So Venezuela in the last 15 years has become one of the countries in the region that has produced more legislation than anybody else. Of course, and if you look carefully at what type of legislation has been produced and the mechanisms by which that legislation has been produced, that's a different story. It's not necessarily the product of deliberative democracy, it's not necessarily the product of a truly democratic the discussion in the sense of a bill being proposed to Congress, or in the case of Venezuela, the National Assembly, which is a unilateral, a unicameral body, but more the type of legislation that has been produced by the president via decree, and whenever the National Assembly is needed, is mostly a rubber stamp and nothing else than that. So that's why I said there's a big caveat. So law seems to be important. Lawyers seem to be important, but from a symbolic standpoint, very symbolically important. To the point that Chavez, for years, until probably the mid-2000s, would start his speeches with a very small, pocket-sized constitution that he would brandish and show on TV, and it became one of the most popular, items to be bought in the streets of Caracas. You went anywhere, and you not only could buy the Constitution, but a lot of people had the Constitution in their pockets. And you would get in the metro and in the subway, and it would be very common to see two regular people talking about their constitutional rights. People would talk about right to health, people would talk about the right to labor, people would almost find anything in the Constitution, or at least tend to think or imagine that the Constitution had an important role in their lives. So laws became important, lawyers became important too. Of course, it's not all laws or all lawyers, but their lawyers and their laws. And then anybody who had an interpretation or an opinion different from the official opinion or the official interpretation then was deemed as someone not only who was not right, or someone who would defer, but someone who was an enemy of the state, who was a traitor, and so on and so forth. So there's this duality. There's this fetish for legislation and for the use of legal instruments, but at the same time, there is a very clever manipulation. I'll give you an example from Cuba. I'm not that familiar with the production of legislation in Cuba, but there is a very serious issue around the world, which is human trafficking, for example. So if you ask, and I ask my students in class sometimes, we start talking about some international or related issues, what is human trafficking, and people would have a very similar imagery of what human trafficking is. They would say, well, it's someone who's vulnerable, who's subject to, who's traded, sold and bought as if they were a commodity. And this is against any really basic rule of natural law. But there is legislation in Cuba. If you look at official statistics in Cuba regarding human trafficking, you would see that the government claims that human trafficking is taken very seriously. There are many cases of human trafficking that are cracked down by the government. People are put in prison, tried, and so on and so forth. But then when you look at what is human trafficking in Cuba, it could be anything, any activity that lures anybody to leave the country. So there's a famous case involving a notorious baseball player, and I think the case has been thrown out in federal court here in the United States a couple of years ago, and the case involved the allegations that this baseball player in Havana had been lured by a Cuban American who was visiting Cuba at the time, as I'm sure happens all the time. You want to play in the major leagues in the United States, I can help you get there, and if we get there, I'll charge you a percentage and I'll be your agent. So that was a human trafficking case. That would not be a human trafficking case anywhere in the world. But if you look on the face of the law, then human trafficking is being prosecuted very heavily. So it looks as if your government is compliant with international standards. If the buzzword is human trafficking, then we are at the forefront of it. And the same, you can find examples from other types of legislation. So moving on, the adaptation of the legal system to strengthen the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela. It started off, so Venezuela and Cuba have a very strong historical ties. One of the first treaties that Cuba and Venezuela signed was in the early 1900s, an extradition treaty. Both countries had some interesting political relations. One of the first countries that Castro visited after assuming power in 1959 was Venezuela. He even spoke in Congress in Venezuela, but then in 1961 Venezuela broke relations with Cuba. That cold period lasted until 1974, I believe, and then between 1974 and now it's been cordial. The peak of it was that during Carlos Andrés Pérez II, Castro even went to the so-called coronation of Pérez, and the relationships were cordial, and there was some exchange. What happens in the year 2000 is that Hugo Chávez and Castro, the occasion had been that there were some natural disasters that affected Venezuela, massive floods in late 1999 actually, the day of the approval of the referendum for the new constitution. Hundreds of thousands of people in Venezuela were affected by these massive floods. The international community offered assistance. The U.S. offered military assistance, disaster relief assistance, and as we understand, members of the public, the ships were on their way until Chavez says, no, I don't want that. I will take some of the doctors that Castro is going to send us. So that's really cemented. It was a window of opportunity that really cemented what would then become the core of Venezuela's social programs. So in October of 2000, Venezuela and Cuba signed what it was called an Integral Cooperation Agreement, signed mainly to exchange oil for medical assistance and education assistance. So this is a really big framework between Venezuela and Cuba. An agreement, an international agreement with legal terms and all that. Then in 2004, ALBA is created, the Alliance of the Bolivarian Countries of the Americas, another important framework treaty that would cement not only the relationship between Venezuela and Cuba, but would also cement the presence of Venezuela, the regional influence of Venezuela and Cuba in the rest of the region. Then by 2007, Venezuela and Cuba, and there are many of these treaties. One of my projects now is trying to assemble an inventory of all these agreements, and it's really hard to do. It's very, very hard to do because they're all laws, but they've been published in different ways. It's really tricky, and as I understand, not even the Venezuelan, probably the Cuban government has a very carefully assembled inventory, but Venezuela, as far as I know, doesn't have such an organized inventory of agreements. In 2007, they signed an important agreement regarding an oil refinery located in Santiago de Cuba. That's posted on PDVSA's website. And in 2011, it was reported that Venezuela and Cuba had entered into at least 100 more cooperating agreements involving at least 116 projects. These are all legal contracts. In 2014, President Maduro announced that he had signed 56 more cooperating agreements with Cuba. So we are talking about hundreds of contracts, hundreds of legal documents. What's the implication of that? And then I move on to my last point. The implication of that is that regardless of any political events that may end or transform or change the shape of what the government looks like in Cuba or in Venezuela, these are legally binding agreements. These are legally binding contracts. So it matters. Nobody could say, then we'll forget about everything else. New government will forget. New government cannot forget about all these legally binding documents that potentially involve third parties. And this is only between Cuba and Venezuela, and there are many triangular relationships involving other countries. So it's a very complicated web of relationships. Last point, use of legal tools as facilitators of political programs. This is a case of the Bolivarian Misiones. For those of you who don't know what the Bolivarian Misiones are, this is a long list of social programs, really programs about anything. It's really a bureaucracy in the shadow. It's a government in the shadow that Venezuela created first in this informal fashion of let's deliver to the people directly. Health became one of the main issues. The first program was called Barrio Adentro, inside the shantytown or inside the slums, and then Barrio Adentro became a mission, and then 50 other programs were created, and then 10 other programs, and now there is the Gran Misión Venezuela, which is really a bold statement to transform the state and to deliver, really deliver funds to people in a kind of an unconditional cash transfer scheme that some scholars have very well documented the use of those misiones at voting purchasing strategies, and I think that's one of the things that you suggest in your book. So anyway, what happens is that for all these misiones to work, you could imagine, well, it's only the checkbook what matters, and Chávez's phone call at the time, and now Maduro's phone call to say, okay, give X amount of money to all the people who live in Sweetwater, Florida, or deliver gas to those who are living in Massachusetts. No. So the government has really made an effort to dress all these misiones with legal mechanisms. And this is what I call the malleability of law. I wrote this piece called Malleable Law, really talking about how counterintuitive it is that all these seemingly arbitrary programs are managed based on a presidential decree that created this misiones. So the idea was to give a lot of flexibility to the social programs. You report to the president only. There is a general in charge of the mission. The general talks to me on my personal cell phone. There's no record of anything. We don't even know how much money they're given, anything like that. But the paradox here is that all of these misiones relied on a decree. So the general was not just someone appointed personally by the president. The general was someone whose authority depended on a presidential decree that appointed him as the head of the mission. So it's an interesting combination of informality, which is what makes things work, with this idea of formality. So those misiones were portrayed as these very efficient institutions, and it might have been efficient institutions for the clientelistic purposes that they were intended to. And they were covered by this idea, this imagery of law. So it's not only something that works in a political sense, but that it seems legally sound from the formal standpoint. I think I'll stop here and then so we can move on. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. I hope Dr. Dwani forgives me. I'm going to change everything that I was going to talk about, because I'm just too tempted by what we have heard here today to discuss it. And if I have time, I'm going to put a timer so that if I have 5 minutes left, I'll talk about the topic I was going to focus on with my PowerPoint on medical diplomacy in Cuba, Venezuela. And I have some of this at the end, but I've decided to start because it's just too tempting. And before I do that, I want to say that as a member of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, Dr. Enrique Pumar is here. He's the head of our student award, the student prize. We're looking for research papers on Cuba. It's a great opportunity. The winners will receive an award as well as present at the annual conference of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy at the end of July, beginning of August. So thank you for that public announcement. It's a great way to get involved, and it's a great project. So my colleagues were asking why isn't Venezuela joining in with Cuba and normalizing and making friends with the United States? And I'm saying, why is anybody surprised? More than a crisis of diplomacy and between Venezuela and the U.S. or the OAS, I think what we have is a crisis of democracy in the region. And this is it, and it's pretty serious. We've seen the steady and alarming erosion and destruction of democracy. I'm reading through my very quick notes that I made here so that I don't take too much time. And what is at the core of that? It's a hemispheric project conceived by Hugo Chávez and Fidel Castro, based on the ideology designed at the Foro de Sao Paulo in 1990 by Lula da Silva and Fidel Castro when the Soviet Union was dismantled, to revive the radical left with a new way to take over power. And the way was not armed struggle, but was through the dismantling of democracies from within, through elections. And what happened is when Hugo Chávez came to power with all the money from oil, well, it was great to advance this project. And now it's called, from recent years, they call it 21st century socialism. You could call it Castro Chavismo, you could call it whatever you want, but it is a neo-communist project in every way. And it's inspired on the pseudo-Marxist Antonio Gramsci, some of you who are students of political science might know, which is to establish cultural hegemony, to achieve power through social fragmentation, to use the themes of populism and class war and poverty to undermine, to create social fragmentation, mass exile, the destruction of the upper classes, to militarize society, and to dismantle the judiciary, the electoral system, to abolish individual freedoms gradually as opportunities are found. Fidel Castro tried this in Chile during Allende, and we don't have time to get into that. But this is a perfect opportunity, and it's advancing. And we have presidents in many countries, well, the countries of the ALBA, of course, Ecuador, Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, are part of this for sure. And then you have a series of presidents in Chile, in Brazil, in Argentina, and Peru that are members of the forum, and maybe I'm forgetting one or the other, or sympathizers, or who have been neutralized because they use blackmail and all sorts of influence. Intelligence services are working constantly to undermine democracy in the region. What is the end result? The end result is a Cuban model. What is the difference between Venezuela today and Cuba? Well, Venezuela is still news. Venezuela is still, people are still outraged by Venezuela. The Venezuelans don't necessarily like to be in line to get the scarce products they get. Cubans are submissive. They've learned to live like that. Fear is internalized. And Cuba is fashionable. Venezuela is still subject of outrage. And I wish I would have time for that. But and the worst thing is that these systems are based on illegal activities because of the ideology that's behind them. It is okay to promote terrorism, to aid the FARC, to aid the narco-terrorists, because that creates social fragmentation and it makes people go to exile, like we've seen in Venezuela. I think it was, Javier, you mentioned the politics of the Venezuelan vis-a-vis the Cubans here in the United States. Well, because what happens is, you've had more than 600,000 Cubans become residents of the United States since 1990. And these are Cubans who've never lived under freedom, who didn't see the radical period, who have learned to internalize that that's the system, and the best thing we can do is, come become a resident, and then, a year and a day later go to Cuba and bring aid and clothes and telephones and for my family, because that, they've been able to put that into the minds of people. Essentially, this is an anti-US project. And it's not because I say so, they say so. I tell you, read, because what happens is, as with the Cuban discourse, it is selective. It depends on the audience to which it is directed. So when it's convenient, they direct a very radical, thematic to selective audiences, and when they want to confuse people and they want to, play nice, then they select something else. So this is the script that Venezuela has learned from Cuba. And this is a very solid relationship with a long-term plan. This plan can take 30 years, and they've said so. I researched for an article that's in World Affairs. If you put in your Google search for real world Venezuela criminal gangs, I researched this and I was astounded. There's